Good morning, eighth grade. All right, so yesterday we talked about the different crops and cash crops that developed from the cotton boom. Talked about corn, hemp seeds, rice, sugar, and all those different cash crops and why they were built. And the reason why is because of the soil. They needed to rotate the soil, and they thought that the people in the South were just getting really, I guess, reliant on cotton. And that was a bad thing, as we found out that it's bad for the soil, and we just don't want to be reliant on one thing. We also talked about how entrepreneurs started to say that maybe we should start to invest in industry because we're so out of date and we need to get back into shape, and we need to realize that we need to keep up with all the progressive movements that's going on with the North in order for us to compete and to stay in tune with all the manufacturing. So we talked about that yesterday. Today we're actually going to start talking about the Southern society, and we are going to talk about slaves and how bad they were treated and everything like that. And it is disgusting about what people thought back then and how it still plays a factor today. So let's go ahead and jump into that for today. So we're going to talk about the four main groups that made up the Southern society. So today we are going to talk about the Southern society, and we're going to be able to pretty much describe the four main groups of the society and the culture that made up the South. So although the South had some industry, agriculture was the heart of the Southern economy, okay? Cotton was king. As a result, wealthy plantation farmers were the most prominent social class in the Southern society. Small farmers, however, made up the largest part of the population. So we're going to talk about these farmers, the plantation owners, we'll talk about the African Americans, and we'll just talk about other people that were regular white people in the South. So typically when we hear about books or we see movies or when people talk about the South, a lot of us hear this story that there was a lot of Southerners who had many slaves and lived on large plantations. Although this is true, it's not as true as what you think. So not that many people own big, large plantations. Only a few people own plantations. And when these people own these plantations, they didn't really own a bunch of slaves. They had a few slaves that they owned because they were expensive. But this just makes it worse. Because they had these huge plantations and they only had a little bit of slaves, slaves had to work all day long. Okay? We also have this idea that in the South it was all about hospitality and well-trained slaves that lived on these plantations, and that's a little bit more common, I guess. They did have a lot of Southern hospitality. People were nice, but they were only nice to the white people, and slaves did have to work a lot. Okay? So even though there was few families that had plantations, these people did have really strong, I guess, influences on everybody else. Because these were the most wealthy people and these people owned like these cotton plantations, they had a lot of power, they had a lot of wealth, so they influenced a lot of the people in the South, and people strided to be like these people. So typically the people that owned the plantations, they're political leaders, and they had a great influence over everybody else in the area. So the first group of people that we're going to talk about are planters. And the planters, these were the wealthiest members of the Southern society. These planters, they had a great influence on the economy because they were the plantation owners and they grew so much cotton and they had so much money. And they liked to some of them showed off their wealth by living in these huge mansions. As you saw in the last slide, if you don't remember, you can just always go back. They had a huge mansion. And some other of them, they lived simple lives and they lived in small houses. But the people that lived simple lives, these were the people that pretty much they invested their money back into get more land, into more slaves. Okay? Some of these plantation owners, it all depended on what you want. If you wanted a huge house, you can have a huge house. If you wanted more slaves, you could. But it all depended on what you wanted to do with your money. So in this planters, in this society, this was the high class. The male planters, they were primarily concerned with raising their crops and supervising their slaves. They wanted to make sure that everything on their plantation was running smoothly, nobody was acting out of hand, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and they wanted to make sure that they were making money. The women, they were the housewives. So the housewives, they took care of everything in the house, raising the children, supervising the slaves, working, cooking. And what these women did, they also oversaw the slaves that work in the house. So they did have some slaves that worked inside of their houses, but they're still slaves, and the women were in charge of them. So the men were in charge of all the slaves in the fields, the women were in charge of all the slaves in the house. Okay, the wives, they also took a big role for society. They pretty much, what they did was they threw these huge dinner parties or big dances, and they did this so their husbands can talk about their plantations with other people and try to get people to invest. Or then when they had these people over, they would show off their slaves if they were trying to sell them to other people. They used their slaves almost as like show horses, and they wanted to make them look good so they can sell. Okay, if you're a child, some of these planters, they often arrange their children's marriages based on their business. So if they wanted to join a plantation down the street, they would probably arrange the marriage between the son and the daughter so they can get married, so they can get more wealth and become more powerful. So that's how the planters would. So some of the kids were, it kind of seemed like the kids were kind of treated as slaves because they were getting their marriages set up just so they can make more money. The next group of people were the Yemen and the poor whites, and this made the majority of the people. So only a few people had plantations, but the most people, white Southerners, were Yemen or poor white people. And these Yemen people, what they were just, they owned small farms. And pretty much these people, they got all the farmland that was typically not used for farming. They either used the lands, all the nutrients up from the land, or the land was in a horrible location. And pretty much they had to make use of what they had. Even though there was a lot of land that wasn't used, their farms, even though we say a small farm, their farms were still huge. 100 acres of land was common. That's like 100 football fields. So this was common for them. The Yemen, since they had to work so hard in getting the nutrients back in the flora and growing and taking care of their family, they took great pride in their work. Okay? The poorest of the white Southerners, they lived on lands that couldn't grow cash crops. All right, so land that was not used for farming or anything like that, and they had to rely on other things. They relied on trade, but they also relied on hunting, fishing, having small gardens, and some of them would do odd jobs for money. Some of these odd jobs was like delivering mail, cleaning up the poop from the horses, fixing the tools. Anything they could do to get a job, that's what they did. They were almost like slaves, but they weren't slaves because they were able to work for money. But they were very, very poor because most of the land was taken up by the plantation owners or the other farmers. Most of the white Southerners, they believed in the same religious beliefs. Because the farms were so big and neighbors didn't really see each other, the only time neighbors or families saw each other were at church events, such as like gatherings or the socials or the revivals. And that's the only time families really mingled with each other. When they came here, pretty much what would happen was the wealthy white Southerners, they would come and they would talk about God and everything, talk about their religion. They were kind of considered Christians because they believed in God. But one thing that was really bad is the white Southerners, they thought religion, because they were believing in God, they justified their position in society and it justified slavery. So part of their religion is that they believe that God created some people, like themselves, the white people, to be superior towards others. And they thought that God created people that were African American to be their slaves, and they should work for the white people. And this is how these white people did this. And this was completely against what the people believed in the North. In the North, they believed the opposite. They were mostly Christians, and they believed that God was against slavery. In the South, they thought that slavery was something that God wanted them to do and something that they needed to do. And they brainwashed everyone saying that if we don't have slaves and we don't treat these people bad and we're not superior, then we're not doing what God wanted us to do. And that was kind of like their religion, which is pretty messed up because we know God created everyone equal and not for us to be treating people like this. But this was part of the Southern religion and part of their society. Their urban life. So many of the largest and most important cities in the South were close to like the ocean or by the rivers, and the reason why was because they were trading cities or shipping centers. So they had these major cities there. There wasn't too many though. There were very few compared to the cities in the North. But even though they were small, they had some of the same characteristics and very similar to the northern cities. In these cities, they had like government buildings, they had water buildings, they had schools, they had well-maintained streets, they had roads, they had hospitals, they had libraries, and pretty much they had all these. And the Southerners wanted their cities to be as modern as possible. They wanted it to be centers. They wanted to compare to the North because this is kind of like how they're trying to stay up with the times. And just like in the plantations, the Southerners used the slaves to perform all the work and all the building and construction of these cities. So slaves that lived in urban areas, they still had the harsh conditions as a slave in the plantation, and they actually had to build everything. Some of these people, they would actually trade slaves, and they would trade slaves. If they weren't doing good in the plantations, they would send them to the cities, and hopefully they were good at building. If not, they would go back and forth. But slavery was used to build everything in the South. So today, as a quick review, we talked about the four main groups that made up the Southern society. We talked about the rich, wealthy planters. Those were the plantation owners that had some slaves. We talked about the Yemen people who had small farms and they took great pride in their work. We talked about the poor whites who didn't live on fertile land, so they resorted to hunting and trading. We talked about the religion, how religion, pretty much their religion, gave them the right to own slaves and they needed to be superior to others, which is a horrible thing. And then we also talked about the urban life and how life in the cities were very similar to the North, but it wasn't the same because they weren't as big as the cities in the northern areas. For homework, I want you guys to answer these questions. Number 1, how is religion an important part of the Southern society? Number 2, what Southern social class do you think had the most difficult life and why? And number 3, in what ways were Southern cities similar to the Northern cities? So that concludes our lesson for today. Hopefully you guys learned something and start to get this picture painted of how bad the white people started to treat the slaves and their morals are the reason why they did it. One thing about history is that we always need to look at things from different perspectives. Back then it was completely normal for them. Now we know it's still bad, and we know it's bad, but still people do that, which is horrible and awful. But yeah, so if you have any questions on the material that we learned today, just go ahead and shoot me a message. I'm here to answer your questions. Hopefully I can reply to you on time. If not, I'll see you guys all tomorrow in our Zoom session. Well, we will be talking about more discrimination of the African Americans, but I'm happy that we're doing it in a live session so we can have a debate or something. Okay? If not, I'll see you guys all tomorrow. Have a great day.